Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with it's not really an update, more like the post-mortem for the first round of the French presidential election. Ha. I will note this is not replacing the uh, coverage this week for the second round. That is still happening on Sunday. This is just diagnosing what happened in the first round, where my model did good, where it went bad, why some of these things happened, and, the actual result. Because that's, the whole point of the channel, forecasting and covering elections. So covering the actual result is important in that. So let us begin. So just right off the bat, there's a huge amount of polling error in this election on everyone but the top two candidates. Macron had a little bit of polling error, but not too much. Everybody, like the other three main candidates, Pécresse, Melenchon, and Zemmour, fairly large polling error. So right off the bat. So my model struggled a bit with that. But there's more. I'll get into that later. So let's start with the overall projection. So this is what I forecast. And, well, I did relatively well forecasting the winners by department. Shouldn't be too surprising, considering it's mostly a two-person race with Melenchon coming in a few areas. But not quite as good as it did in the Canadian election. So there's that. But this map here, what I forecast, suggested that Le Pen was strong in the south, strong in the north, and a little competitive in the center east-ish. But overall, Macron was relatively strong, with his only real notable being West Paris and Brittany, for any notable areas of strength. Strong support. What we actually have here is Le Pen is relatively strong in the north, strong in the south, and is very competitive to the center of the country. Not necessarily the center east, but just the straight up center of the country. Macron is very strong in the northwest, West Paris, and a little bit through the rest of the country around the large urban areas that haven't been hollowed out by the overseeing of industry. So basically, the urban areas that haven't completely suffered over the last 20 years, 30 years even, he's done relatively okay. All the urban areas that have done really poorly, either because of major cultural change because of high immigration, or just the complete overseeing of all of the industry. Those two areas voted heavily Le Pen or Mélenchon. Now, Mélenchon is quite interesting. He completely dominated East Paris and a lot of the suburbs of Paris, and did very well in a lot of the core overseas departments, to the point that he completely broke my model in every way, shape, and form there. I believe Guadeloupe, he's got over 50% of the vote, and I forecast him at like 20. Like, pretty huge overshoot. Now, the unfortunate thing with the data available for the French elections, I would say that even if the polling was correct, the polling miss in Guadeloupe and Martinique the model miss was basically guaranteed to happen. They do not do a lot of polling by region in the French election, and regionality is very important when you're talking about forecasting. At least the way my model works, it's very useful, and I would argue in general it's very useful because areas of the country obviously vote different from other areas. There's no country in the world that has an actual real electoral system. And now I will note here, when I say real, I don't necessarily mean like it's fraudulent. I just mean there's actually competitive parties in it. It could very well be non-cheating. It's just if there's no competitive parties, not really real elections. But in every real election system, parties have different bases of concentration because different types of voters live in different areas. Notably, the blue-collar post-industrial workers live mostly in the north, as one example. So obviously, the north of France is largely going to vote differently than, say, Paris, which has relatively fared just fine from the overseeing of most of the industry. Now, Paris has other problems, but economic destitution is not one of them. And I say economic destitution, I mean relative. I'm sure, not having ever been to places like Pas-de-Calais, I'm sure it's not a third world country level, but the prosperity has definitely decreased by any metric for years, and this is true anywhere that was heavily industrialized and didn't have the ability to transition. Oftentimes, the ability to transition is just impossible, but that's neither here nor there. What this does show, this result though, this first round result, is actually a very interesting thing for France. My projection showed a much more balanced France. The regional divides were much less smaller. Even in the north, where I forecast largely in Le Pen's column, we see here in like and Ardennes and Haute-de-Mont and Meuse and Pas-de-Calais are all much harder voting for Le Pen than those departments in my projection. And even places like Voyage and Moselle or Eure, again, I apologize for any pronunciation problems, but I'm doing my best. Also, much strongly for Le Pen. The entirety of the Pas de Loire way heavily voted Macron. Way more than my model projected at all. Now, I will note, I think this one I actually probably would have caught if the polling error was less, because a lot of this is a strong, or relatively strong Les Républicains vote share, especially in Vendée here, and Mayenne and Sarthe. But the Les Républicains vote completely collapsed. They got less than half of what I projected them in my April 8th video. And a lot of those, and Macron also got about 1.2% more. So, not surprising. One of those areas most affected is Pas de Loire, but again, heavily concentrated. So, will this be a problem for France going forward? Not necessarily. There's plenty of countries that have very strong regional divides. The trick is, especially with France, because France is a very centralized country, they have to make sure that different regions of the country perceive fairness. Now, this is true in every single country. Every region doesn't need to be equal. That's impossible, obviously. But there has to be fairness to it. That is, just a step to Canadian politics, that is the main grievance typically of Alberta, Saskatchewan, lesser extent of BC, and lesser extent Manitoba, is that they don't perceive the Canadian federal government as fair to them. And this creates a whole host of problems, which is a big concern for France, because in a centralized state, there isn't the regional devolution to tackle a lot of these issues, whereas even in a relatively weak federal government like Canada, or sorry, a weak federal system like Canada, I say weak because the provinces are quite constrained on what they can do. I would, not being an expert on the French political system, I would assume the French regions have less power than Canadian provinces, but I could be wrong. There is a lot, but to go back to what I'm saying, Canadian provinces do have a lot of open ground. That can adjust and do things differently, which eases some of the stress strong regional divides can have. US is a perfect example where you can have two states, for example, let's say Florida and California, which are very diametrically opposed right now. All working in the same country, so if you don't like one, you can go to the other just fine. The powers of federalism. Now, I don't want to get stuck too deep in this rabbit hole, because I could spend probably the next 20 minutes talking about it, and that's not the point of this video. Though if you want to hear the next 20 minutes of this, or some facsimile of it, let me know in the comments below, and I could cover that someday. And by someday, I mean I'll put it on the idea list of things I should cover. So I won't go over every single, in general, department I gotta miss on. That is just farcical. First off, I think it'd be really boring. And second, you can see here visibly, you can compare and contrast. I've left on the screen for, 10 minutes now? 11 minutes? So anyone who wants to compare and contrast, I think you've had plenty of time. And if not, pause the video by all means. Though please unpause afterwards. Gotta finish the whole thing. So now let us skip over to the the part I like more. Numbers. Wow, look, spreadsheets. Isn't this fun? Anyways. I did my best to try to break this up to make it better. If this looks horrendous, let me know. And I won't do this again in the future. I'm particularly referring to this part. So we'll get to this in a second. We're going to go with department forecasts first. So here, by region, just for simplicity's sake, and I'm grouping the 5 overseas departments I projected as overseas, just because I didn't know what else to call them. So as you can see, I had 3 in the safe column, and I'm going to bring this down here for a second, just to explain. So safe is if you're in the 35 plus column, likely is if you're in the 30 to 35, lean is if you're 25 to 30, tilt is if you are 20 to 25, and toss up is if you are too close to call. For example, Eure-Loire, right here. With that out of the way. So I had 3 safe, 26 likely, 54 lean, and 20 toss-up departments across all of France in my projection. Of these, I got 2 of the safe correct, 24 of the likely correct, 44 of the lean correct, and 12 of the toss-up. As you can see, there is the percent correct here. I did the best of the likely. Safe, technically is worst number, but I only had 3 chances, and 1 is a complete and utter miss because of either a combination of polling error and dearth of polling data. All in all, about 80% accuracy. Is that the right term? I think it's the right term. 80% accuracy in classifying the winner of the department. Now, obviously, this is France. Winning departments literally means nothing, but my model does it. I'm adapting a model based off of a parliamentary system to a presidential election, so I have to have some geographic region, so I might as well project this, and it is a margin. It is a metric which I evaluate if my model's good or not, so might as well talk about it in the video. There's really nothing to say here. I think a lot of these misses are polling error. Several of them, especially in Ile-de-France, are missed because Melenchon did way better than he was polled to do. So there's only so much I can do based off of bad polling data. Now going to the actual results. So up here we have the actual official results from whatever the government body that officiates the results. I can't think of the name of it. The Constitutional Council, maybe? But it doesn't matter. So I have my April 8th forecast and my April 9th addended forecast. So my April 8th forecast did not include any polls that were released on April 8th. My April 9th addended one includes polls that were released on April 8th. The reason why the forecast is listed as April 9th, not April 8th, because it came out on April 8th, is just the model works better if you pick the next day to calculate the model results than if you calculate it too many days in the future. It gets a bit wonky. That's just a funny quirk. Don't worry about that too much. So, before we consider any polling error involved, my mean squared error, which I'm not sure how much statistics my viewers have taken, but it's just a type of error metric. In and of itself, it actually means nothing. 86 mean squared error has no intrinsic meaning at all. It just is. It's a relative number. So I had 86 mean squared error on my April 8th projection, and my April 9th slightly better at 70. We can see in some of these smaller subsamples, I did a really bad job forecasting Melenchon. I had a 52 mean squared error. Almost all of my mean squared error, more than half, is in Melenchon alone. Again, somewhat relevant with Macron, though not too bad. Again, quite significant with Les Republicans, and a smaller but still relevant amount for Zemmour. Going to the April 9th, I did better with Zemmour, better with Le Pen or Pécresse, worse with Macron, worse with Le Pen, and better with Melenchon. In fact, I'll get to that in a second. So that is kind of what I did. So I'm personally going to stand by this result harder, even though this one is technically better, because this is the one I did the video for. So this is the one I'm staking it. It is technically the worst outcome of my model, but is the one I published, so it's the one we are going to mostly compare. This is just here for food for thought of what would happen if I waited a day to do the update. Turns out, would have been slightly better, but still 70's actually fairly bad. To give context here, I should have done this earlier. Boop, boop, boop. Bear with me. Sometimes I forget to queue things up because I'm a single person. Here we go. So, a throwback. This is my Canada forecast for September 20th, 2021 election. My mean squared error for Canada, the entire country of Canada, was about 8. France, this is just under 11 times worse. That's a bad result. I will admit, fully right now, my model did not do particularly great. Now, I have the defense that there's big polling error, which I'll get to in a moment. But even if we remove the polling error, which I do here, or some of it, oops, I still did bad. 31, or well, 30. Let's round it up. 32. I'll get into some reasons why I think I did bad. One of them I think is known, but I'll get into that in a second. So, what I mean by I removed the polling error. So, here and here is for polls up to April 7th, and this is the polls up to April 8th, the date that they're released. And this is what the naive polling average is for all the polls in April up to that day. Using this naive polling average, I calculate the mean squared error from the actual result, and I've subtracted it from the mean squared error of my model. It's not, strictly speaking, the most rigorous solution to remove the polling error from my error numbers, but it's good enough approximation, and considering the only people who care about this are me and you, and most of the people watching this are probably not hardcore statisticians, this approximation is probably fine. If you are a hardcore statistician and you are deeply upset by my approximation here, And you will, and just to be clear, this is a pretty big approximation because mean squared error, I'm squaring error numbers here, so you can't naively subtract. It doesn't really work that way, but I am naively subtracting because of simplicity. I think actually if I didn't naively subtract, I would probably even get better numbers, but we're gonna go with the worst ones. I think if I did it properly, it'd be better for me, but we're not doing that. So I will note I only subtracted for Melenchon, Macron, Pécresse, and Zemmour because everyone else did not have that much polling error. Like if you look down here, most people's polling error was less than 1 by a lot. Just overwhelmingly less than 1. Macron is a little above 1, so I've included him just because it is significant, just not a lot. It doesn't impact it too much. Again, the big ones are Zemmour, Pécresse, and Melenchon. I also do the same thing for my April 9th forecast. So if we subtract out the error, I get 32 and 20. 20 starts getting into the upper end of what I would consider acceptable in my model. We look here, the CBC model for Canada was about 16. I don't think it was a particularly good model, but my French model is in the same ballpark as this one. So I guess in regards to the French election, my top line numbers up here were as good as CBC. So that's a pretty big cell phone. But hey, if I didn't go through and dissect where I did wrong, how could you trust me going forward when I made mistakes? So we removed the polling error. We saw a lot of error. So why do we have a lot of error? Now, I will put one caveat here. I have not exhaustively searched through the code or the files that put the data in yet. But I have two hypotheses that I feel pretty strongly about. One, it's barely even a hypothesis, it's basically just a confirmed fact of my model. So my model struggles to deal with a candidate like Melenchon, who was polling really poorly, relatively speaking, up until like the last 2 weeks before, maybe the last 3. Wait, we can go over here. Boop, boop, boop. I think that's a typo. It only was supposed to be 14, but whatever. It's too late now to fix it. So he was doing relatively poorly up until March 27th when he starts gaining a lot of ground, March 20th, and then he starts gaining a bunch of ground pretty quickly. My model handles that really poorly because it's a weighted average of all the polls, and if you have a really small amount of polls near the end that show a big swing, it seems like my model doesn't handle that very well, and I knew this going into the forecast on April 8th. I even said as such in the video that I suspect if I have a lot of polling error, a lot of it's going to be model error. It's going to be from Melenchon. Turns out it's even worse than I thought it was going to be. I was forecasting about 14.75, and he was going to get 16.56 range, which is still a pretty big miss, I will note, or too big for my taste. But you also added all the polling error that occurred on top of that, so it was quite significant, unfortunately. The other one I will note, my other main source of error that I'm thinking of, or not thinking of, that I suspect crept in, is between, notably, Macron and Le Pen. Now, you might ask yourself, you look at your brilliant numbers, they're not too bad. What are you going to... Oh, I will also... Sorry, just to sidetrack for a second. No, actually, Pécresse and Zemmour are almost 100% polling error. I don't think I muddled anything wrong there, but the Le Pen and Macron Their polling error, especially if we look at my April 9th forecast, this is where this main argument's coming from, or this main hypothesis coming from. They're quite off. Like, my Le Pen numbers for April 9th are 2.5 points above what she actually got, and Macron is 1.7 points below. That's a pretty big miss. Now, there's a couple reasons I think why this happened. Or not a couple reasons. There's really one. So my model does trying to correct historic polling misses. Sort of. It's a bit more complicated than that, but like you look at the election history in France or any country that is polling, and polling tends to be off in a predictable way. However, France, and I kind of knew this going in, I should have maybe put this caveat in earlier. I didn't, so it's kind of my bad. But France was a lot more finicky in the polling error because a lot of the parties running are new. In fact, for example, Zemmour is completely new. So it is difficult to properly forecast the polling error, and I think somewhere in the code, it might be a code bug, it might just be a data entry bug. I haven't really been able to diagnose it yet. I've been too busy. And frankly, we're 4 days since the election, so I haven't had much time anyways, even if I wasn't busy. It seems my model systematically overestimated Le Pen and systematically underestimated Macron. More so than the polling even suggests. I had a kind of inkling about this in early March when Macron was polling into the 30s and he peaked well below that, when in theory he should have gotten closer to that. And, well, that's obviously a flaw. My suspicion is it's related to how the model handles new parties in particular. I think I had a similar issue in the Canadian election, whereas, frankly, we can even just bring it up because I already have the spreadsheet open. We see here that the real result for the People's Party was 5. I forecast 3.4. The real result for the Conservatives is 33.7, and I forecast 35.9. And you will note, any clever viewer out there who can read, the People's Party and Conservatives are almost 100% of my polling error in this election. Shouldn't be surprised. I think that's related. Now, it's not because, in that case, I think it's the People's Party voters I forecast as Conservative voters. This isn't the case that some voters that I forecast for Le Pen would have been Macron voters, but because of how new parties interact with the model, and there's several of these that were essentially considered new parties, frankly, Macron himself is kind of a new party also, like Les Républicains En Marche, or Les Républiques En Marche, is, frankly, a new party. It's existed for, 5 years? But the way these interacted with the model, I suspect caused Le Pen to overinflate her score. And the way that my polling error correction occurs likely also overinflates people who are traditionally overperform their polling. And you will note, Le Pen overperformed her polling either day. So did Macron, for the record. So, historically, and by historically I mean, I think the one election, well, I guess, this is all to say, trying to summarize this up, I had to look, I believe my model has an issue with how my polling correction occurs, I need to look into this more deeply, but I suspect it exponentiates itself when it shouldn't be working properly. The way I'm handling it kind of propagates, like overcorrects it, which is why I got Macron and Le Pen's numbers quite off, especially if you look at the April 9th numbers. And it's also probably why the People's Party and their conservative numbers were also quite off. Will I have a good, clever solution for this? I don't know. That's future me problems. And in fact, if people are curious, comment below if you are. I can actually put an update out when I decide to resolve this. If not, people aren't interested in that, I will probably just mention it as a throwaway line in some video somewhere. I don't have any plans to fix this yet because I have no idea what the problem is. But that is... Well, either of these problems I don't... there's really no way I could have fixed the Melenchon one. Well, no way's a strong word. I could have cranked up the beta value, which... Long story short, the beta value controls how much recency bias to put in polling. But even then, it wouldn't have done too much. Because again, if we look at the April 9th result, it's actually relatively close to what the naive polling average is. But, only so much I can do on that one. So all this to say, there is a couple of points where my model definitely has some flaws that I hope I've spoken thoroughly to assuage anyone's questions. I'm going to look into trying to solve them. I'm not sure how to do so yet. Frankly, part of the problem is my sample size for elections with this model is too... Technically speaking, I use the same techniques in the Virginia governor or gubernatorial and the 2020 U.S. presidential ones, but I drastically overhauled the model from the U.S. presidential and the Virginia gubernatorial. I used a simplified version of the model, which didn't project geographical regions. One of the reasons why controlling national errors is quite difficult is because I project to geographical regions. It makes perfect sense in Canada, who is a parliamentary democracy. It makes less sense for single seat races, though I would argue it is more interesting to look at a map than to look at a spreadsheet. That's not the right spreadsheet. Then a spreadsheet. Spreadsheet, map. Comment below if you are map gang or spreadsheet gang. Let me know. I'm firmly in map gang. I think maps are better. And with that hot take at the end of the video, I hope you all enjoyed the video. And this is the wrong map. What? Well, apparently I lost the second round numbers. I don't know what happened there. That's weird. If you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below what you thought of the model results, if you thought it was good enough for your taste, if you feel satisfied that I've diagnosed what's went wrong, if you were just shocked as I am about how comically high the polling error on Melenchon was. Like, let's be real here, guys. Like, they underestimated the poor man by 5.5 percentage points. They missed him by an entire Jadot. Like, oh my god, that's terrible. Like, how? Anyways, with that, I bid you all a wonderful day, and I will see you on Sunday with more French coverage.